My grandson called me a charity case. My son and daughter-in-law laughed. The next morning, I had one suitcase left. Everything else I'd owned for 53 years fit inside a single black garbage bag that my daughter-in-law Linda had left outside my bedroom door. That's when I knew. That's when 71-year-old Bryan Calloway, retired Marine, former contractor, man who'd built 3 houses with his own 2 hands, understood exactly what he had become in the eyes of the people he loved most. A charity case. It had started so innocently, the way these things always do. 8 months earlier, I'd suffered a mild stroke. Nothing catastrophic, the doctors assured me. My left hand had a slight tremor now. I tired more easily than before. But my mind was sharp, my legs were steady, and I could still make the best smoked brisket in Harlan County, something I told anyone who would listen, mostly because it was true. My son, David, had called 2 days after I was discharged from the hospital. He had his mother's voice, soft, warm, reassuring, and I'd always loved him for that. Carol, God rest her soul, had been gone 11 years by then, and David was the best living piece of her I had left. "Dad," he said, "Linda and I have been talking. We want you to come stay with us, just for a while, until you're back on your feet." I protested. Of course I protested. I was Bryan Calloway. I didn't need anyone's help. But David was persistent, and the house did feel emptier than usual those first nights home, the silence pressing against the walls like something alive. So I agreed. Just for a while, I told myself, just until the tremor settles. I drove myself to their house in Raleigh with my suitcase, my toolbox, and a Dutch oven Carol had bought at a flea market in 1987 that made the most extraordinary pot roast you've ever tasted in your life. David and Linda had a beautiful home. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a kitchen island the size of a small aircraft carrier. They also had 2 kids, my granddaughter Sophie, who was 16 and barely looked up from her phone long enough to acknowledge gravity, and my grandson Marcus, who was 13 and had recently discovered that being cruel was a personality. I noticed the shift almost immediately. When I'd visited before, holidays, birthdays, the occasional summer weekend, I had been Grandpa Bryan, the man who taught David to change a carburetor, the man who'd once arm-wrestled 3 of David's college friends and beaten every single one of them, the man who showed up with homemade peach preserves and stories that went on 15 minutes longer than necessary and made everyone laugh anyway. Now I was something different. Now I was the old man who lived in the guest room, the one who left his reading glasses on the kitchen counter, the one who occasionally forgot he'd already told a particular story and told it again, the one whose slightly shaking left hand sometimes made the spoon clink too loudly against the bowl at breakfast. Linda was never unkind, exactly. She was precise. She spoke to me the way people speak to complicated appliances, careful, deliberate, slightly louder than necessary, as though my stroke had affected my hearing rather than my hand. She reorganized the kitchen so my Dutch oven was on the highest shelf. She hired a cleaning service and made a point of mentioning the cost within my earshot 3 separate times. David was caught somewhere in the middle, loving his father, but desperate to keep the peace in his house, which meant he laughed at Linda's jokes even when they were at my expense, and he let things slide that Carol would never in a million years have let slide. Marcus, though, Marcus was something else. The boy had a gift for observation and a complete absence of filter. He'd noticed that I ate slowly now. He'd noticed that I went to bed at 9. He'd noticed that I watched the Weather Channel with the volume slightly too high and that I had opinions about proper lawn care that nobody had asked for. He collected these observations like ammunition and deployed them at the dinner table with the casual cruelty only a 13-year-old boy can truly master. "Dad," he'd say to David, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "does Grandpa have to watch his shows in the living room? It's kind of the whole house." Or, "Mom, is Grandpa staying forever? Like, is this just his house now too?" Linda would say, "Marcus," in a tone that meant stop, but also somehow meant I agree with you. David would look at his plate. I would pretend I hadn't heard, because the alternative was acknowledging it, and I wasn't ready to acknowledge what I was slowly becoming in this house. The night it happened, we did pot roast. My pot roast, from Carol's Dutch oven, a recipe I'd been perfecting for 30 years. I'd spent the better part of the afternoon on it, browned the chuck roast in batches, built the fond slowly, added the herbs at exactly the right moment. I set it on the table with the particular quiet pride of a man who knows he has done one thing absolutely right. Marcus took one bite and said, "It's okay, I guess." Then he turned to Sophie and said, loud enough for the table, "Grandpa makes dinner so we don't feel bad about him living here. It's like when homeless people hold signs that say we'll work for food." Sophie's mouth twitched. Linda covered hers with her hand, but not to hide horror, to hide laughter. David looked up and then, "And this is the part I will carry with me until I die." David laughed too. It was small, barely a sound, more an exhale than a laugh, but it was there. It was unmistakable. And Marcus, emboldened, delivered the killing blow with the cheerful confidence of someone who has never once been told that words leave marks. "You're kind of a charity case, Grandpa," he said. "No offense." The table went quiet after that, the way a room goes quiet after something breaks. I put my fork down. I folded my napkin. I said, "Excuse me," in a voice so steady it surprised even me, and I walked to the guest room and I closed the door. I didn't sleep. I lay in that room, their room, I understood now, always their room, and I thought about Carol, and I thought about the house in Harlan County, and I thought about who I had been before I became a guest in my own son's mercy. I thought about the tremor in my left hand, and the way I tired easily, and the doctor who had smiled and said, "Mild stroke, Bryan, you're lucky." And I thought, am I lucky? Is this luck, lying in a borrowed room while your grandson performs your smallness for the dinner table? By 3 a.m, I knew what I needed to do. I got up, I dressed. I made myself coffee in the kitchen, quietly, so as not to disturb anyone, a habit I'd developed over 8 months of making myself invisible. I sat at the kitchen island and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Tommy Brewer, my oldest friend and former business partner, who answered on the 3rd ring with the gruff acceptance of a man who has known you long enough to understand that middle-of-the-night calls mean something serious. "I need a favor," I said. "Name it." "My tools are in your storage unit, and your sister still owns that rental property on Millbrook Road, the small one, the 2-bedroom. Is it vacant?" A pause. "It is." "Bryan, what are you?" "I'm going home," I said. "Not to Harlan, I mean I'm going home to myself." The second call was to a contractor named Pete DaSilva, whom I'd mentored for 12 years and who owed me more than either of us had ever formally acknowledged. I told him I was ready to consult again, part-time, advisory, nothing strenuous. He said, "Bryan, I've been waiting for that call for 8 months." I was packed before sunrise. I left the Dutch oven on the kitchen counter with a note that said it was for David, that his mother would have wanted him to have it, that I loved him, and that he needed to do better. I didn't elaborate. David was a smart man, he would understand. I left a separate note for Marcus. It was short, it said, "Marcus, I was a Marine. I built my first house at 26 with $400 and second-hand lumber. I put 3 kids through school working double shifts. I buried your grandmother with my own hands because she asked me to handle it, and I did not let her down. I have never asked a single person for charity in my life, and I am not about to start. I'm not telling you this because I'm angry. I'm telling you this because one day you'll be old, and someone will have to decide what you're worth. Start deciding now. What kind of man makes that easy for people?" Grandpa Bryan. I drove out before anyone woke up. The Millbrook Road house was small and needed work. The porch boards were soft in 2 places. The kitchen faucet had a slow leak that had stained the basin copper green. The backyard was overgrown with whatever volunteers themselves into Carolina clay when nobody's paying attention. I stood in the middle of the empty living room with the morning light coming through dusty windows, and I felt something I had not felt in 8 months. I felt like myself. I fixed the porch boards that first week, the faucet the week after. I started consulting with Pete on Tuesdays and Thursdays, just a few hours, just enough to remind my brain what it was for. My left hand still trembled slightly, but it could still hold a level, still hold a pencil, still make a point. David called 2 days after I left. He was upset in the way people are upset when they've been confronted by their own failure before they were ready to see it. He said he hadn't thought it was that big a deal. I told him that I knew and that the not thinking was the whole problem. He came to see me 6 weeks later alone, without Linda. He sat on my newly repaired porch and he looked at his hands for a long time. Then he said, "Mom would be ashamed of me." "Yes," I said, "she would, but she'd forgive you too because that's who she was. I'm working on being more like her." We sat together after that without talking, the way fathers and sons sometimes can when there's nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide, listening to the neighborhood settle into evening around us. Marcus wrote me a letter 3 months later, handwritten, 2 pages, slightly crumpled like he'd started over at least once. He said he'd been thinking about what I wrote. He said he'd looked up my service record. Apparently the internet has everything, and he didn't know I'd been to Vietnam, or that I'd received a commendation, or that I'd served 22 years before anyone in the family had been born. He said he was sorry. He said, "I didn't know who you were." I wrote back, "Now you do, come visit, I'll teach you how to build something." He came the following spring. We spent a Saturday replacing the last 2 boards on the back fence, nothing complicated, nothing ambitious, just 2 people with wood and nails and the slow satisfaction of making something crooked straight again. His hands were young and unscarred, and absolutely certain of themselves. Mine were old and trembling, and had held up more than he would ever fully know. Between us, we built something that would hold.